Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Neck of the Woods, the podcast where we talk about what's going on here in Ward 1 and around Calgary. My name's Jacob McGregor, as you know, a candidate for City Council in Ward 1. I'm here with my co-host Jason Diodati, and we have our first guest on Your Neck of the Woods this week. Mr. Mike Baker, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'll do so. Thanks for having me, Jacob, Jason. Glad to be here. I'm Mike Baker. I'm just a supporter of Jacob. Currently I work as the VP of the Calgary Police Association and the Vice President of the Alberta Federation of Police Associations. Been a policeman for 23 years, like justice issues and like doing things that enhance my community.
Awesome. Thank you for being with us this week. So this should be an absolutely fascinating conversation because, as all of you know, Jason actually graduated Mount Royal with a degree in criminal justice himself. So when we're talking about crime and community safety issues in Calgary, we should have a fair amount of things to talk about with these two. Jason, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely, Jacob. Thank you so much for the introduction. And again, welcome everyone to Your Neck of the Woods. And, Jake, like you said, we were just talking about this before we started recording. And yeah, I'm a criminal justice graduate, which, I want to tell all of our viewers means a good amount. I do have some sort of background in this field, but that doesn't make, what I say or what I believe to be, the end all be all. I am no police officer. I'm no lawyer, but yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very interesting conversation.
So, thank you, Jason. I want to start today by saying I have lived up here in Tuscany in Ward 1 for almost half my life, and I have noticed a change in how safe I feel in our community. Back when we first moved to Tuscany, we would be fine if it wasn't for the cats leaving our doors unlocked. But now we feel like that's something we can't do, and it's not like we're in the highest crime community in the city, but it just feels like there's more going on. Mike, would you want to speak to any trends you've seen?
Yeah, you know what, Jacob? I'll first put it out there, put the disclaimer out there. Actually, I'm born and raised here in this city, so I have a pretty long, extensive history here, and I too would probably, I started policing in 1997. And certainly in that time frame, I would suggest that our city has grown exponentially. And of course, with big cities come big city issues. And I think those issues are manageable. However, if we don't manage them, they tend to grow and they grow exponentially and cause us grief.
How about you, Jason? You've lived here pretty much your whole life as well, so...
Yeah, exactly. And very similar to Mike, I would agree that, as Calgary has grown and transitioned into that, big city to what at least I see now as a major city, just as our population seems to climb, you are, inevitably going to see an increase in, criminogenic activity, especially, what was interesting, and I don't want to get off topic here, Jacob, but what was really interesting was to see the trends and the way that crime adapted to these times of being in COVID. And so the reason I bring that up is because while we're a big and growing and expanding city, and with that comes, its fair increase in crime, I think one of the other trends we're noticing now is a little bit more visibility to those crimes that can sometimes, depending on the area, depending on the specific, nature of the crime or the criminal act, can be more of a it's more exposure based than it is an actual growing trend. So, I find that now, while we have a little bit more time in our lives, we're not able to go out as much and do the things that we normally would do. Reporting is going up. So I'll give you an example. I've been reached out to by a number of my friends, a lot of my, female friends, who have said, Jason, what is going on? The crimes against women in this city, seem to be skyrocketing. It feels like every second day I'm reading about, individuals or women who are being, violently either assaulted or preyed upon. What's happening to my city? And I'm not here to take away from any of the victims or to say that, oh, it's not a big deal. Of course it's a big deal. But I think it's the idea that we are now moving through life at a lot more of a slower pace. And so that reporting is a lot more front of mind, and our surroundings and environment are a lot more front of mind versus when we're all so dying to get to our next, A to B to C, meeting this, meeting that, friend this, coffee here. I think it's becoming more, top of mind. And I believe that with the increase in media, crime is so fascinating to a lot of people that we now have even more individuals in across the city being a little bit more pertinently aware, if that makes sense.
It does, and lots to touch on there. We'll get to both the fascination aspect, as we've seen, also the rise in, the idea of these true crime things, where there's entire shows like this dedicated to talking about interesting and extravagant crime to some degree. But first thing I want to touch on is the changes you've said this year has brought on, because I would agree that things are a little more noticeable when we have more time to notice them. But I would also, another thing that's become very, say, contentious in the past year is the role of the police in community safety. And that's one of the reasons I felt like I wanted to have Mike on to talk about the role you think police can play even in this time where there's way more scrutiny on police actions.
For sure, Jacob. And you know what? The evolution of policing, we look at what's happened over the last few years, but certainly in 2020 and the attention brought to the injustices that people, especially people of color, have faced dealing with the police. And you know what? I don't think anybody can argue that there's not historical references or examples of when the police haven't done what they need to do to represent those people in their community. And you know, I think what it requires is everybody to take a step back, look what our relationships are and how we can enhance those relationships. That being said, do I think that we are a typical U.S. police service? I would say not. I would say that Calgary Police Service has always been a community-based police service. A lot of the initiatives that we've put into place, community policing initiatives, have been in place for, you know, years, if not decades. Whereas the push, say, south of the border, you get a lot of suggestion that the police work collaboratively with, let's say, like mental health workers. Well, you know what? That's something that Calgary Police has been doing for years. So I just think that some of the scrutiny is misplaced. Is really where I'm going.
That's interesting, because let's talk a little bit about some of the community initiatives that, say, the CPS is involved in, because I don't think there's a lot of maybe awareness sometimes, and then we can go on from there.
Sure. And buddy, the first thing that's going to come to my mind, Jacob, is when we look at our support teams. We have partnerships with police officers and mental health workers that go out and take care of these wellness checks. We have social workers that work with police officers. We go out and we check family situations in relation to children's well-being and children's issues, family issues. Domestic conflict. We have teams that go out and work with the individuals in the community to address, ongoing domestic conflict related issues and how best to address those, how to get people out of these environments, how to help people deal with the stresses of what's going in their life that cause these problems. School resourcing. And you know what, I think growing up, we always had our school resource officer that helped us establish how we perceive the police and the relationship with the police. You know what? So ultimately, all of these programs, Jacob, they've all been in place for years and years and years, despite the fact that we're just seeing it over the last year where calls for these types of programs.
It's interesting that you mention SROs because I don't know about you, Jason, but when we were both in high school, I had a very good relationship with our SRO, Constable Kubchak, and I found him to blend very well with the student community, and that was a very good example of something like a program like that can do.
Absolutely. I was just going to shout out Officer Kupacek. I mean, he, to me, is the standard. I don't know very many SROs, so not to say that there's nobody else in the city or elsewhere that does that same work or goes to that same level. But to me, he is the standard. He has always approached students with respect, which I think that in that age demographic, when I can think back and you can think back, Jacob, and I think we can all think back there. Even you, Mike, the idea that we all feel like authority is trying to tell us at that time of our lives what we can and can't do, and it's almost we see them more as the fun police than the law police. We all try to find respect from our elders, at least at that point in time. And one of the things that Officer Kupacek did was show us that respect. He wasn't treating us like an inferior or like a child. He treated us as an equal. And I think that was key, and I think that is part of the keys to success, even in Calgary, with the Calgary Police overall. At least from what I've noticed personally, and again, please understand, I am a white male. My perspective is not the same as somebody who is a person of color or in a different demographic. But at least for me, I even in situations where I've been in the wrong, call it a speeding ticket or, in a parking lot after hours, that the city of Calgary has said you're not supposed to be in, there was never a lack of respect. And I think that is a key with community policing is respect and empathy. And to Mike's point, absolutely. I mean, as much as the Youth Criminal Justice Act in 2003 was a federal act, at the same time, I believe that was, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's really when the Calgary Police took a good, hard look at their community policing overall. And to Mike's point, I mean, it's been decades that these services have been around. But anyway, not to go far past what you were asking, but that's exactly it, Jacob. Our SRO was awesome, and it's a great service to provide.
And another thing to touch on just from what Mike was saying about these community programs, I think it's great that these mental health and wellness sort of teams and checks exist, but I think the police are often called to mental health crises at too high a level, as we discussed during our episode on mental health. And that's why the concrete steps to reduce the number of people in crisis that I want to take are so important.
What do those steps look like, Jacob?
Yeah. Sorry,
Jacob, maybe you didn't hear me. What are those steps and what do they look like?
Oh, yes. I appreciate that you may not have heard or seen. So the AHS online mental health portal where you can like search for services is very bare bones. You can only search based on your location. And I'd like to see something on, say, the City of Calgary website where you can search based on availability, cost, condition, give people more of a starting point for when they're searching for mental health services. And then as well, like to try and remove cost as a barrier and have like a pilot project with the province where we introduce something like the low income transit pass, but for mental health services.
Great ideas, my friend. Great ideas.
Yeah, like Jacob, like we talked about, it's that the biggest question in anyone's mind who's going through a mental health crisis or crises is, where do I start? Right? What's the starting point? I've identified that I'm not doing well. I've identified that I need help. But where do I go? And that can be a horrifyingly daunting question that one has to ask themselves when you're in that crisis. And so to provide, Jake, to your point, and I completely agree, it's a great points. We need to create exposure and create the right platform so that no matter what walk of life, no matter what your socioeconomic index, standing is, no matter where, what demographic of people you come from, everyone should know, where do I start? I have a mental health crisis. Where do I start? Whether that's calgary.ca/mental health or, where do I start.com, whatever the medium is, it needs to exist, and it has to be less than the bare bones that you described, where tell me your location and I'll give you over 100 clinics and services offered, and start picking up the phone and see which one actually applies to you and your situation. There needs to be more than that. Absolutely.
And ultimately, gentlemen, what both of you have suggested is ideally what we're going to do to avoid police being involved in mental health situations that ultimately don't need to happen. Prevention and education will allow people to access these resources much earlier so we don't end up in crisis situations.
Exactly my point.
Absolutely. It's if the police are responding, in my mind, we have failed that individual all the way up until that point, right? That individual should have had the ability to prevent, or should be, there should be some sort of divergence that can be handled. And if it's gone into the hands of the police, it's not, in my opinion, it's not the police, Calgary Police's fault, but it's everything else that has failed. And that's, Jake, we talked about this last time. The justice system is there as a last resort when all other things fail, when support systems fail, when services fail, when attempts to rehabilitate or to coach fail. That's when the justice system, takes place. But until then, we really need to give people an opportunity to help themselves, specific, of course, to mental health crises, before it gets to that point. And that's exactly, and I'm glad, Mike, that's exactly where we are right now with Calgary Police and the attempts. I wouldn't say that the Calgary Police are not able to handle, instances of mental health crises. But as I've explained to my friends who go to me and go, Jason, I couldn't imagine going up to somebody who seems to be either, let's pick a mental health, condition, whether, schizophrenia, and I can never imagine tackling that person and pushing them down and putting them in handcuffs. And I go, listen, it's not, it's not always, for lack of a better term, without being flippant here, it's not always stamped on the individual's forehead, right? We don't know. And the Calgary Police, again, when you're a police officer, and Mike, you can correct me, you can talk about this better than I can, but when you're a police officer and you're responding to many different calls and you're being that multifaceted member of the community, it can be tough sometimes, a lot of the time, to not blur those lines. And as somebody somebody who's looked at what we call blue light syndrome, where it's that constant vigilance, that constant feeling of anxiety and of really overvigilance, it becomes so hard to blur those, to see those lines clearly and not to blur them, right? And so if we can just, if we can divert or prevent prior to that, I think it's, in the best interest of all parties.
And another thing you think that happens quite a bit, Jason, is unfortunately police are the default responders. So 24/7, 7 days a week, who do we call? We call fire, EMS, police to deal with some of these issues. And you know what? It would be great if we had all of the resources available to deal with any problem 24/7, because we are, we're 1.25 million people. We are a big city, and we have lots of resources. Just unfortunately, it's access to those resources. So by default, a lot of times when addiction issues or mental health issues, or they go hand in hand, something happens where the crisis goes to 0 to 60 immediately. The default call is to the police, because people don't have access to other resourcing, or they're not able to identify exactly what is going on. So yeah, some guys acting in this fashion, they call the police, and the police arrive on scene and have to deal with what's there.
So
Totally.
let's take a sec, because we've heard a lot this year from a group called Defund, and I imagine everybody here has, and we've touched a little bit on how they may be a little off base in calling for reductions to the CPS budget in order to fund community health initiatives, because these things already kind of exist. But let's just have some of your thoughts on, say, defund to fund, Mike.
Well, Jacob, very contentious issue, and I think I always like to start off by addressing what defund the police means to me. And we get in, especially on social media. I'm somewhat active on social media, so from time to time we get into these discussions, and the common understanding is just take money away from the police. Let's get rid of the police. Let's not have them take care of responsibilities that the public don't deem the police to be responsible for. And quite honestly, I think the police support that. They don't like being the default supporters. The training and resourcing isn't always there. So defund the police means to me is allowing resources, whether that be monetary or what have you, to go into certain silos within the community that are intended to deal with those community issues, whether it be addiction, whether it be mental health, whether it be homelessness, anything that we can alleviate the responsibility or the perception that the police are responsible for, might be of benefit to the community. And certainly we have so many police officers in order to attend calls. If we don't need to send police officers to calls, let's not do so.
Yeah. I would say we've basically been coming at that in this conversation for a while now. If we can reduce the amount of times you guys are called, oh, that's great, right? It means we're having more positive outcomes. But that doesn't necessarily have to be in this this anti-police as an institution sentiment.
For sure.
Absolutely.
And buddy, I think that the traction over the last year of the anti-police sentiment, it's fueled by social media, but I'm going to be fair, is the police also have to take a look and how did we let it get to this scenario? I'll just speak from my own service, and like I said, I'm with the association, so I'm not speaking on behalf of our service, but the initiatives they've put into place, things like in-car digital video, body cams, those are all introduced to promote accountability, to ensure trust with the public. Recently, there's been some calls of the police are against the public. Nobody signs up to come work a job where we're against a community. Why would you do that? Why would you subject yourself to that for 25 years? The people that come to policing want to enhance their community. They have a strong sense of ownership. So I understand it appears to be a trend right now, but I think the discussion is what's most important, and let's just hash out the issues.
Absolutely.
I'm completely with you there, and as somebody who has relatives, maybe not in the local police, but in the RCMP, I can tell you that these people don't go into the police services federally, provincially, with the city, with any intent of harming their community. At least the vast, vast majority don't. And so I think we gotta just have more conversations like we're having today.
I completely agree, and if I can weigh in too, it's the idea being that I think a lot of the defund fund and the whole idea of defunding the police is really it's a confusing issue, because I think that it applies. We're seeing it across North America versus being either just in Canada or just the United States. And I think it confuses the issue of a lot probably being a little bit of a too general of a word, but a lot of police services across the United States who receive surpluses, vast amount of surplus of equipment from, either higher up, agencies, or whether that be from the Army. And so what a lot of this, what a lot of people are looking at is, why does Salt Lake City have a tank-like SWAT vehicle for their state? I mean, or for their city. Why do they have, carbine rifles that are issued in war? And to be funding those kind of to be funding militarization versus to be funding training is where I think a lot of and especially training for mental health, perpetrators or victims or what have you, or those suffering from mental health, is I think where the real sentiment comes from. And then I think that issue is confused in Canada with the idea that there's this belief that we are also over-militarized, and it's something we spoke about in our degree, plenty of times. I had the opportunity to speak to, at the time, the police chief of Taber, who happened to be there during the Taber shootings. 10 years later, he was mentioning an officer came in with full tack gear and body armor and multiple weapons, a weapon on his waist and some hand-to-hand combat weapons. And he kind of mentioned that officer. It's like, where are you going? Like, we're in Taber, Alberta. I get it that there's risk and crime and the potential for escalation anywhere, but why do we need this kind of equipment? And again, that was anecdotal and somewhat of a long time ago for at least my conversation with him. But the idea being is that I think that's where the sentiment comes from, and the misunderstanding is fueling the idea of why do we need the police? And it's whoa, it's a little whoof. I think we're jumping the gun here, for lack of a better term.
And Jacob, if you don't mind, I'd just like to comment on a couple things Jason said there too. The militarization of the police. And you know what, Jason, that's a great point. Guess who's responsible for that? It's the police services. You need to communicate, and you need to explain to the public why, unfortunately, these tools, in essence, is what they are required in order to resolve scenarios. And we'll go with the armored personnel carrier. It sounds great when we have a barricaded subject. And when I say barricaded, they're in a closed off space with a weapon that can reach out and touch somebody. Let's just say, call it a rifle. In order to get within close proximity, you know what? It's not like a policeman in body armor can just walk up to the door and place whether it be a package of smokes, whether it be some food, whether it be medication, whatever we're getting to when dealing with a negotiation to try and end a situation peacefully. Things like that armored personnel carrier are important. If we go back to Black Friday here in Calgary, we didn't have a support. We didn't have a TAC team. We didn't have any of these things. And ultimately, you know, we had a barricaded gunman that was prepared and showed the police how grossly underprepared they were to successfully resolve the scenario. The public was put into jeopardy. The police were put into jeopardy. The suspect was put into jeopardy. And so ultimately, some of this militarization of the police, you know what, that's perception, and perception is reality in the public. However, the police services have to do a better job at communicating just why these tools are there so that we can successfully conclude scenarios.
Absolutely, and that's really, and that's why I've loved, you know, at least from in recent, you know, future in recent times, the transparency that the Calgary Police is adopting and is demonstrating, because exactly to your point, Mike, it looks scary to the outside eye and looks like an overkill of resources, and this isn't necessary and this isn't needed, and why do we have all of this? But there's a reason for it, and if we know what that reason is, the perception becomes, oh my gosh, these guys don't care about, you know, the safety of people. They're here to with guns and to reenact the best movies they've seen, which is, if you can believe it, a real sentiment that I've heard from certain people. It's more the idea of, no, these are the tools that we need in certain situations. And really quick, Mike, if you don't mind my asking, are you referencing what happened was that in Beddington, if I'm not mistaken?
Sorry, Jason. I think it was 19. I think it was 79 or 73, and long before my time. Long before my time. But that was the actual establishment of the Calgary Police Tactical Unit, because they were just outgunned, outarmed, and ultimately Boyd Davidson lost his life as a result of this, and they ended up having to go down to the barracks and utilize military personnel carrier in order to resolve this scenario. So, and I look at things like, if we even look back out east, folks, and look at, you know, a couple of years ago, we got a mobile gunman that certainly terrorized the community for a long period of time. And you know what, a sidearm, you know, for people that aren't educated on what rifles and sidearms, they're very limited. It's close range. It's so in order to deal with certain threats, they need things like carbine rifles or what have you. Otherwise, we're doing this community a disservice because we're not able to handle every situation. And when you call the police, you expect them to deal with the scenario.
You know, Mike, that's actually fascinating to hear, and I'd love at another time to just talk more about the history of CPS, because I that is a story I hadn't heard, and I think that story a lot of people hadn't heard. Everybody knows about the TAC team or SWAT in the States or things like this, but not necessarily the situations that necessitated these. It's a bigger instrument than your patrol officer. So, but yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that.
Anytime, buddy.
On sort of a lighter note now, I sort of touched on this recent fascination we've sort of run into over COVID with the idea of these true crime podcasts, and some people say they glorify criminals and other things like this. What's your guys' sense on crime in pop culture?
You know what, buddy? I'll be the first to say that I don't think it's strictly related to COVID myself. I think I started policing in 1997, and I will say even over that duration. You've seen public acceptance of maybe less desirable behaviors, or the rise of the anti-hero. And I think it's just societal values. I don't know if we blame it on pop culture, on music, or what have you, but there's a slight erosion with access to the internet, access to philosophies, and ultimately, over time, we've just seen a little bit of how we perceive crime change. It's not glamorous. I've seen it. I've seen very people that have made a lot of money doing bad things. Life of crime usually ends one way. Two ways. You either end up being held accountable for your actions, or you may end up perished.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, Mike, that's a great point. I mean, the idea being that the fascination and the, like you said, the societal values of the interest in crime, I think is an old one. I think is like has happened for a while. And I think, Jake, what we're noticing is a little bit, very similar to the age of information. It's higher exposure. I think that fascination and that interest has always been there. But instead of having a popular medium like a podcast, because we all now have, data abilities to connect to the internet and satellites with our phone, that same large demographic of people who are interested, I think we're reading crime books, true crime novels, even reading fiction just to be a little bit more, immersed. However, I will say that a lot more, at least within my own personal community, there has been just a touch of a bit more of a bump. And I think it comes back to people having time. But people, now approaching me and going, hey, have you listened, are you familiar with Nancy Hicks, like on Global News? She's awesome. And she talks about all of these local Calgary stories and gives the victim, dignity while doing it. And it's great. But I think it tends to jump into that side of people just having more time. But it is still fascinating to see the kind of traction that these podcasts pick up. Some of them that I've been listening to, my favorite Murder is one of the podcasts that I've been listening to for quite some time. And when I started listening to them, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, they were just two awesome ladies, in their basement, running this podcast. And now they, if I'm not mistaken, they have a deal with Spotify. So it's the traction has grown, exponentially. And it's really difficult, at least for me, it's difficult to say where it comes from. But it is, there's something to be said about that long-term trend.
See, that's interesting, because the reason I brought up, like, the true crime stuff was the podcast and sort of the recent tools that have evolved in the last 5 or 10 years and have exploded during COVID. But as you said, there's always been this sort of interest. Even if you go back to, like, the Mob and to Bonnie and Clyde and things like this, and Al Capone, that we have museums out in the prairies talking about Al Capone and the booze runner and Prohibition. So I don't, and this is where I may just slightly play devil's advocate with the erosion of values sort of angle that, Mike, you took, because we've seen the same sort of thing going back to at least the 20s. So, but obviously the tools have changed.
Yeah, and when I go that way, Jacob, I guess the majority of what I'm getting at is the sensationalization of a lifestyle. And when I say that, I mean everybody can pull up their device now, their smartphone, and we're all somewhat connected to social media. And the way that social media works is it's there to capture you the best moments and you the best light, and you're living the high life, drinking the best drinks, eating the best food, driving the best vehicles. And the realism is, not everybody has access to all of these things. So if we're trying to keep up with the Jones, we're trying to keep up with the buddy next door. You know what? Food, family, housing, a lot of these responsibilities don't allow for people to pursue that. And unfortunately, I think what we see, I try and put myself into a position is, if I'm growing up, I'm entering a workforce, my opportunities are limited, yet I want to live the best life I can live. Yeah. It's hard to say or to be critical of folks that fall into that catch. I want to live the good life. I want to have everything too.
And not to butt in here, but that it's a very, very interesting and a great point, Mike, because how many profiles do I see now in comparison to even 5 or 10 years ago, where through a friend of a friend of a friend, or I'm just going into the deep, deep abyss of Facebook, where you stumble upon an account and it's that glorification of the lifestyle of criminality. So, the first photo of so-and-so's this individual's Facebook page is, a hand on what looks to be, a handgun and a bottle of, Grey Goose vodka in the other hand. Right. And so it's this now new idea that, like Mike said, you could, go down the route of having a family and a good stable career and children and all that great stuff. But if you're keeping up with the Joneses and you look at the options or if you were to boil it down to two roads in life, the traditional or non-traditional being more along the lines of criminogenic or a little bit more fringe, on the fringes of society. It's what do you choose? And there's now, if you look at both paths, yes, you can see all of your friends and family with pictures of their kids and vacations and things like that and family time. Or now there's this glorification and this lifestyle of, fast money, fast, blah, 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 nice cars, all this alcohol. And there's now this, glorification of the lifestyle that when I was growing up with the social media that we did have, the Nexopias and the MySpaces, it was not very common. Now I can find it. Yeah, I'm really giving it a throwback there. But, just the idea that, when I look back at that data and look at what today's data is, I am much more likely to find a profile that is, hit me up on WhatsApp and I got the good. And it's like, dude, you put that as your bio on your Facebook page. Like, anybody looking at that knows what you're doing, but it's the idea that, well, that's how hard I am. Like, I'm not afraid of nothing, blah, 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 kind of deal. Does that make sense?
What's also funny about what we're talking about is these people that are trying to mimic that lifestyle have sort of closed themselves into a world they may not like because when you put that stuff on your profile, it's there now. People can see it. So even if you want to turn around and go back to a more traditional wife, kids, family, job, career, make the most for myself, it's harder to do that because you made those choices earlier.
In ink. You know what I mean? Like, you made those choices in ink. You put those, in a sphere that a copy of that is, can be and will be around for a long time. 100%.
So we're running a little bit short on time here, gents. So I just want to get your guys' final thought. We could go on talking about this forever, I think, because this has been a great conversation this week. But just your sort of final thoughts on community safety and policing in Calgary?
For sure, Jacob. And I'll go to the social media aspect as well, and that's where I really focus some of my comments are is seeing where the direction we appear to be going. Don't get me wrong, I'm all about efficiencies. I'm all about the taxpayer having an ability, only so much ability to pay. However, I think nobody can enjoy the fruits that Calgary has to offer if we don't have a safe community. And as of late, we've seen, in 2020, 2021, gun crime is increasing. We're hearing more about shootings, unsafe acts, muggings, robberies. And then again, well, where are the police to deal with this? Well, the police can't be everywhere all at once. And from the policing standpoint, we are operating at capacity. And it's not exactly easy to bring policemen into the city, especially given the current environment. So we have to do more with less and more with less and more with less. And ultimately, those impacts will have an effect on community safety. So what I want to see, and Jacob, you and I have had this discussion and how we connected, is I want a city council that wants to maximize public safety in a fiscally responsible manner. And from what I've seen from Jacob, that's what I'm expecting. So,
yeah. And that's what I'm hoping to deliver, as more and more of you have become hopefully familiar with my campaign. I want to bring the city's budget in order, keep your taxes low, but also maintain safe, vibrant, and happy communities. So, I think you and I, Mike, are on very much the same page. Jason, your final thoughts for the week, man?
Thank you so much for having me on again and gracing us with your knowledge, Mike. We really appreciate you being on and giving us, your 2 cents. And my kind of final thoughts are very aligned with the both of you in the sense of that's what I'm looking for out of my city council is an optimization of safety and efficiencies with budget in mind, right? And being knowledgeable about the issues and the realities of our city, and not working in with the idea of optimal conditions, because it just isn't optimal conditions, right? We just aren't there. I will say that we all in Calgary need to just continue to push those, just like you're doing, Jacob, push those services, find a way to help the Calgary Police by diverting and giving the resources to those individuals who don't need to go through the police service, because it is that default service, to give this agency the ability to do their job super effectively, and to handle what their expertise is, and to look at and to be involved in situations where crime and criminality are not affected by a mental health issue. And so, my final thought is I'm excited for our next Neck in the Woods, but this has been an awesome conversation. And like you said, Jake, we could talk about this all day. So I'm hoping we do another one of these on crime, and maybe we can get Mike back into the conversation, because I think that there's still so much more to talk about.
I would gladly have Mike back if we're to do another episode on these issues. I'd like to finish off by saying thank you very much for your time today and your service with the city in general. And we will be talking again, I think. And I'm very glad we were able to connect on social media like we did. So that's another week of what's going on in your neck of the woods. And next week, we will be touching on another part of what we just talked about, keeping your taxes low and getting Calgary's budget in order. And we have another guest, Mr. Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So look forward to that. That's what's going on in your neck of the woods. Thank you, boys.
Thanks a lot, Jacob. Thanks, Jason. Great perspectives, my friend.
Thank you, Jacob, and you as well, Mike. I hope we get to chat more, about this and other things in the future.
Look forward to it, gentlemen. Thanks for having me, and look forward to next week's edition.
All right.
To next week's edition.